I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestionable.
So William just walked into a royal reception and handed his own father an ultimatum in front of cameras, in front of courtiers, with Camilla standing 8 feet away. And within 24 hours, her office was cut out of every succession meeting in the palace. And honestly, the part that gets crazy is this wasn't a family argument that got out of hand. This was 3 weeks of planning that ended in one memorandum Charles couldn't put down. Before we get into all of it, hit subscribe real quick. We go deep on stuff like this every week, the stuff that never makes the official palace statement. All right, let's start where the story actually begins, because by the time William walked into that reception room, the outcome was already decided. Windsor Castle, 11:30 in the morning, the 18th of September. Charles is greeting a line of charity leaders. Camilla is standing close beside him, and everything about the room says ceremony, not conflict. And then William just walks straight past the receiving line toward his father. No warning, no aide clearing the way. Just William moving with the kind of calm that honestly should have scared everyone in that room a lot more than it did. Here's the thing. William didn't wait for a private room. He didn't wait for the cameras to be turned off. He delivered the demand right there in front of the same courtiers who'd spent the morning smiling for photographs. He told Charles to remove Camilla from succession planning completely or lose his cooperation as heir. Full stop. No negotiation built into that sentence at all. And look, succession planning isn't some ceremonial phrase. It's the actual confidential process for how the crown, the staff, and the authority of the monarchy get handed from one reign to the next. So when William put that on the table in public, he wasn't asking his father to pick a side in a marriage. He was asking him to pick a side in the institution itself. Charles just stood there. Aides say he looked genuinely blindsided, like he'd expected pushback from his son. Eventually, just never like this, never with the whole room watching. And Camilla reached for a chair and then stopped herself because sitting down in that moment would have looked like she was already losing. Then William placed a sealed memorandum on the table between them. 22 pages, according to a household account of that morning. Household appointments, access logs to succession briefings, specific attempts all documented by Camilla's private office to shape what happens after Charles is gone. Charles didn't open it. He just looked down and asked for the cameras to be moved back. And that's the moment, that's the part that actually tells you everything, because a man with nothing to hide doesn't ask for the cameras to leave first. But what William was preparing to reveal about exactly how far Camilla's office had gone, that's the part nobody in that room had any idea was coming. Okay, so before we go any further, you need to understand what William was actually protecting here, because this isn't just about hurt feelings or old grudges. This is about who controls the machinery of the British monarchy the second Charles can no longer do it himself. Succession planning, in real terms, is the confidential blueprint for what happens during a transfer of power, who keeps their staff, who loses their office, who gets briefed on matters of state before anyone else. It's not written into some public document you can look up. It happens behind closed doors, usually years in advance, and honestly, most people watching this channel have never even heard the term until a story like this breaks. And here's what makes it matter so much right now. William isn't just the heir anymore. At 43, he is closer to the throne than he has ever been, and every structural decision made today about staff, about access, about who gets a formal voice in his future household becomes basically permanent the moment he's crowned. So when Camilla's office pushed for a formal consultative role in his future court, that wasn't a small ask. That was Camilla trying to write herself into William's reign before William had even said yes. Now, William's reasoning here isn't political, like genuinely it's personal. He watched his father spend 2.5 decades slowly rebuilding Camilla's public standing, one engagement at a time, one carefully placed photograph at a time. And William never resented that part. What he couldn't accept was that same rehabilitation quietly extending itself into decisions about his own future court, his own staff, his own reign. That's a completely different thing, and the fact that Charles never drew that line himself is basically what forced William to draw it in public. There's also a very specific number that matters here. By the spring before this confrontation, Camilla's private office, just 5 staff members, according to a household budget account, had been copied on at least 11 internal briefings related to future household planning. 11, not 0, not 1. 11 separate instances where information about William's future reign passed through an office that constitutionally had no formal claim to it at all. And look, here's the detail that should worry you if you're William. None of those 11 briefings were ever formally authorized. They just kind of happened. Nobody stopped them. Nobody flagged them. That's basically the definition of informal power quietly becoming real power. And it's exactly the kind of thing that if left alone for another 5 or 10 years becomes almost impossible to reverse. So when you hear family disagreement, genuinely throw that phrase out. This was William looking at a slow, quiet erosion of his future authority and deciding the erosion stops now while he still has the leverage to stop it. But Camilla's team had been building towards something bigger than 11 briefings. And what they were actually preparing to formalize, that's the part that changes how you see everything that happened at that reception. But to really understand why William could deliver that ultimatum without flinching in front of cameras, without so much as raising his voice, you have to go back further than most people realize. Because this didn't start with a memorandum. It started decades earlier with a boy watching his mother slowly disappear from the center of his father's life. Here's what most people forget. Long before Camilla became queen consort, William grew up watching his father defend her quietly, consistently, even when defending her meant absorbing public criticism that could have been avoided. And William never saw that loyalty as wrong exactly. What he internalized, basically without realizing it at the time, was a pattern his father's love for Camilla would always come with a cost that somebody else had to pay. As a teenager, William watched Diana carry the public weight of that arrangement almost entirely alone. And whatever you think about how that period played out, the psychological residue of it landed on William specifically not as anger at Camilla existing, but as a kind of permanent vigilance about what happens when personal loyalty starts overriding institutional boundaries. That vigilance never left him. It just went quiet for about 25 years. And genuinely, this is the part that turns your stomach a little bit. If you sit with it, William has spent almost his entire adult life watching his father soften every single boundary whenever Camilla was involved. Small things at first, a title here, a public role there, access to information that technically should have stayed with working royals only. Each individual step looked reasonable enough on its own. Nobody was going to go to war over one extra briefing folder. But William was counting. According to a senior aide's account, William began privately tracking instances of what he called informal expansion as far back as 2019, 5 years before this confrontation ever happened. 5 years of quiet documentation just sitting there waiting for the moment it would actually matter. So when Camilla's office pushed for that formal consultative role during the succession rehearsal, William wasn't reacting to one bad meeting. He was reacting to 5 years of patterns stacked on top of a childhood spent watching the exact same pattern play out with his mother on the losing end of it. And here's the detail that's honestly the most personal part of all this. William has never once in any documented account said Camilla doesn't deserve her place beside his father. That was never the fight. The fight was always about whether that place beside his father quietly turned into a place inside his own future reign. And after 5 years of watching the line blur, William decided he wasn't going to find out the hard way whether it would blur completely. That's not politics. That's not strategy for its own sake. That's a son who watched this exact dynamic hollow out his mother's position, once already refusing to let it happen to his own reign next. But while William was quietly documenting 5 years of pattern, Camilla's office was doing something far more concrete. And the plan they were actually building, that's the part that's about to get genuinely staggering. All right, so here's the part that actually stopped me cold when I first went through the details of this, because what Camilla's office was building wasn't vague influence peddling. It was a specific written protocol drafted, amended by hand, and placed directly on the table during a confidential succession rehearsal at Buckingham Palace. The document itself ran to 6 pages. 6 pages with handwritten amendments across at least 4 of them, according to a household account of that meeting. And the core proposal was this: Camilla's private office, which at that point employed 5 staff members under her private secretary, would retain what the protocol called a formal consultative role in household appointments and communications after William took the throne. Now let's be specific about what that actually means, because consultative role sounds harmless until you break it down. The protocol would have given her office access to selected briefings before they reached William's own working staff. It would have allowed her advisors input on staff transitions during the single most sensitive period any monarchy goes through, the handover itself. and it would have given her a formal say in how Charles's reign got represented publicly after his death, which genuinely is a huge amount of narrative control to hand to one private office. And here's the detail that makes this so audacious. This wasn't presented as a suggestion. It was presented as a finished protocol ready to be signed, sitting on the table next to two constitutional advisors who'd been brought in specifically to review continuity planning. Camilla pushed it forward herself. Her hand moved it across the table toward Charles and William directly according to someone who was in that room. The strategy, honestly, was actually pretty clever if you think about it. Camilla wasn't trying to seize power outright. Nobody would have signed off on that. She was trying to normalize a formal advisory role before William ever had the chance to say no to it as a whole, get it institutionalized early while Charles is still on the throne and still inclined to protect her, and by the time William actually becomes king, reversing it looks like he's attacking his own stepmother rather than correcting an oversight. And she came close. Genuinely close. Charles read through the protocol at that rehearsal and, according to the same account, said only that every option deserved consideration. He didn't reject it. He didn't defend his son's position. He just left it open, which in a document like this is basically the same as letting it move forward. That one sentence from Charles is the moment the scheme nearly succeeded. If William hadn't been tracking the pattern already, if he hadn't already spent 5 years documenting the small expansions leading up to this, that protocol might have quietly become permanent policy inside 18 months. Does any of that sound like protecting a grieving widow's future dignity? Or does it sound like a calculated bid for institutional power wearing the mask of loyalty? William pushed the protocol back across the table without signing it. But Camilla's team didn't stop there, and what William discovered next about how far that office had actually gone, that's the moment the entire story flips. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. Because after that rehearsal, William didn't just get angry and walk away. He ordered his own team to compile every single instance where Camilla's office had touched succession matters, and what they found went a lot further than one 6-page protocol. A documented staff meeting recorded in writing by someone present according to a household account showed one of Camilla's aides discussing in specific terms how key communications could remain under Camilla's influence after Charles's reign ended. Not hoped for, not suggested. Discussed as an actual operational plan weeks before the rehearsal ever happened. And this is the moment where the whole story shifts because it means the 6-page protocol wasn't a first move. It was the visible tip of something that had already been in motion internally for at least a month. William's team cross-referenced it against those 11 briefings from earlier in the year, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't informal drift anymore, this was coordinated. Here's the detail that honestly should stop you cold too. The memorandum William eventually placed in front of Charles ran to 22 pages. 22! Not because William needed that much material to make his point, but because every additional page was another documented instance of the same office reaching further than it had any right to. Named meetings, specific dates, the staff aide's own words recorded. And William didn't confront his father immediately. He sat on that memorandum for close to 2 weeks, according to someone close to the household, deciding exactly how and when to use it. That's not someone reacting in anger. That's someone building a case the way you'd build a legal one, quietly, methodically, with every fact anchored before it ever sees daylight. What changed everything, though, wasn't just the volume of evidence. It was one specific line inside that staff meeting record a sentence where the aide reportedly said Camilla's influence needed to outlast the transition, not just survive it. Outlast the transition, not survive it, outlast it. That's the sentence that told William this was never about protecting Camilla's dignity during a difficult period. It was about permanence. And genuinely, once William read that sentence, the calculation changed completely. Up until that point, he could still tell himself this was overreach he could quietly correct through private conversation. After that sentence, private correction wasn't enough anymore. He needed something Charles couldn't soften, delay, or bury behind closed doors, which meant it needed a witness. Which meant it needed to happen where the whole family, and eventually the whole country, would see it. So William had the evidence. He had 2 weeks of preparation behind him. What he didn't have yet was the moment to use it, the one moment that would make it impossible for his father to look away. And what William did with that memorandum next, that's the part nobody in that room saw coming until it actually happened. So here's where it actually gets kind of brilliant when you think about it, because William didn't make a speech. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't even wait for a formal family meeting. He just walked up to his father during that reception in front of witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or explained away later and put 22 pages on a table. And genuinely, that's the move, not the memorandum itself, the timing. Charles could have buried a private letter. He could have quietly shelved a one-on-one conversation and pretended it never happened, the way he'd done with every warning William had sent through private channels before this. But you cannot unsee a memorandum handed over in front of courtiers and cameras. The moment William chose that setting, he removed his father's ability to do the one thing Charles had relied on for 2.5 decades, soften the confrontation until it disappeared. Here's the thing people keep asking: can William actually do this? Can an heir who technically has zero constitutional authority while his father is still on the throne force a restriction like this through sheer leverage? And the answer is yes, and here's exactly why. William wasn't invoking some formal legal power. He was withdrawing his own cooperation as heir from every joint strategic meeting with Charles going forward. That's not a law, that's leverage. And in a monarchy that depends entirely on a smooth, credible transition, an heir who publicly withdraws cooperation creates a crisis the institution genuinely cannot absorb quietly. So the actual mechanism here was simple and completely irreversible the moment it happened. Charles's private secretary, within hours of that reception, was instructed to temporarily remove Camilla's office from all succession-related communications while a permanent settlement got worked out. One instruction, no press release, no public statement yet, just a name pulled off a distribution list. And that's genuinely the part that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. This wasn't a punishment delivered through anger. It was delivered through paperwork. Camilla's office lost access to 11 ongoing briefing threads within the first 24 hours. 2 scheduled planning meetings already on the books for the following morning were canceled outright, rather than simply held without her representatives present. Charles didn't fight the instruction. According to someone close to the household, he read it, said nothing, and let his private secretary carry it out. That silence, the same silence that had enabled Camilla's influence to grow for years, was now doing the opposite. It was letting William's boundary stand without a single word of resistance from the one man who could have blocked it. And here's what made the move impossible to reverse. Once those briefing threads were redirected to William's own team, rebuilding Camilla's access would require an active decision to reverse course, not just a passive return to how things were. Passive drift had built her influence up over 5 years. Active reversal was the only way to rebuild it now, and that's a far higher bar for Charles to clear. William felt no relief doing this. Multiple accounts describe him as exhausted rather than triumphant in the hours after. But the move was done, and it was done in a way nobody inside that palace could quietly walk back. What nobody expected, though, was how visibly the fallout would show up inside Windsor within 24 hours, and there was one specific consequence Camilla hadn't planned for at all. Here's the thing about royal power shifts: nobody ever announces them. Nobody stands at a podium and says the balance of influence just changed. Instead, you get one specific visible moment that tells the entire story without a single word being spoken. And if you know how to read it, it says more than any statement ever could. For this story, that moment came at the next major royal ceremony after the confrontation. Camilla stepped out of the car first, according to footage widely circulated afterward. William approached her directly, not his father her, and extended his hand. He waited visibly until she accepted it. Only then did he turn toward Charles. To an outsider, that probably looks like nothing. A polite gesture, maybe a few seconds long, but in the royal world, every single element of that sequence carries meaning, and this one carried an enormous amount. William approaching Camilla first in public immediately after cutting her office out of his future reign was a deliberate signal. This was never personal cruelty toward her. The boundary was institutional, not emotional, and he needed the country to see the difference with their own eyes. And genuinely, the order mattered as much as the gesture itself. If William had gone to his father first and left Camilla standing there, the narrative writes itself as humiliation. Instead, by going to her first, waiting for her to accept his hand, and only then turning to Charles, William reframed the entire story in real time, not the heir who humiliated his father's wife, but the heir who drew a line and still showed her basic respect. The clip spread everywhere within hours. Commentators slowed it down frame by frame. Some read it as reconciliation. Others read it as calculated political theater designed to soften public backlash after a genuinely brutal week inside the palace. And honestly, it was probably both at once. That's exactly what makes this channel's DNA interesting, because William's gestures are never purely sincere or purely strategic. They're both layered on top of each other. Charles, watching from a few feet away, reportedly said nothing during the exchange, but someone present described his expression as a mixture of relief and something closer to grief relief that his son and his wife weren't standing in open hostility in front of cameras and grief at watching in real time that the boundary William had drawn was now permanent and public. Camilla's own reaction mattered too. She accepted William's hand without hesitation, according to the same account, which royal watchers immediately read as her own signal, an acknowledgement in front of the entire country that she wasn't going to fight this loss of formal influence in public. Whatever fight remained would happen behind closed doors, not in front of cameras. So the message landed, clearly, publicly, without a single quote from anyone involved. But Camilla's team still had one operation left to run a last attempt at damage control. And that attempt and exactly how it fell apart is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. So within about 48 hours of that public handshake, Camilla's team went into full damage control mode. And look, this is the part where you actually have to give her people some credit, because the strategy they tried wasn't stupid. It just ran directly into someone who'd been preparing for exactly this for 5 years. A senior advisor close to William reportedly urged him to approve a soft, public statement describing the whole confrontation as a misunderstanding language that would have let everyone involved save face without confirming anything about the restrictions Camilla's office had just lost. That's the classic move. Blur it, reframe it as noise, not substance. Let the news cycle move on to something else within a week. William refused, flatly, according to someone involved in that discussion. He said soft language would let the exact same interference continue quietly, while forcing him to publicly pretend trust still existed between him and his father's wife. And genuinely, that refusal is the moment Camilla's damage control strategy started falling apart, because the entire plan depended on William playing along with the ambiguity. Meanwhile, inside the palace itself, the practical collapse was already visible. Camilla's briefing box, the secure container carrying official papers reserved for senior working royals, disappeared from her desk entirely. She asked her secretary, who'd ordered its removal, got an answer and closed the door without saying anything else. That's not a dramatic scene. That's just quiet, administrative confirmation that the access is gone, and everyone in that office understood exactly what it meant. 2 more scheduled engagements involving both Camilla and Charles got split into separate appearances that week, officially described internally as routine scheduling. Nobody believed that internally, and honestly, nobody was supposed to. The message was the scheduling itself. Here's where it really fell apart for Camilla's side, though: the legal briefing. Constitutional advisors reviewed the entire situation and concluded in a documented account that Camilla held no independent right whatsoever to shape the next reign's household. None. Any future role for her office would depend entirely on William's personal consent going forward, which meant the 6-page protocol from the rehearsal couldn't survive an accession without his signature. Legally, her entire position had been resting on informal goodwill the whole time, and that goodwill had just run out. Camilla confronted Charles directly after that. In a private conversation later described by a palace aide's written account, she warned that she'd withdraw from upcoming public duties entirely if William's restrictions became permanent. That threat put Charles in an impossible position: reverse his son's decision and lose William's trust completely, or accept Camilla's retreat from public life after decades of carefully rebuilding her standing. She had spent nearly 2 decades outmaneuvering people who underestimated her patience. But William had never underestimated her, not once in 5 years of quiet documentation. Charles still had one final decision left to make, and what he chose and what it actually cost each of them is where this story finally lands. And then, on a quiet Tuesday morning with no press conference, no statement prepared in advance, Charles did the one thing that made it impossible to pretend anymore. He signed it. A permanent protocol formally excluding Camilla and her private office from succession planning, from future appointments, from regency discussions, from any communication reserved specifically for the sovereign and the heir. No drama, no public address, just a signature and a document that closed every door William had spent 5 years watching stay open. Here's the thing that makes this final action so consistent with everything that came before it. Charles didn't frame this as his son's victory, and he didn't frame it as his wife's defeat either. According to the wording released afterward, it was presented as the necessary line between marriage and monarchy. Two separate things finally separated on paper after decades of being allowed to blur into one. And genuinely, that distinction mattered enormously to Charles personally. He kept Camilla's title, her residence, her security detail, her charitable patronages, her ceremonial precedence beside him at official events, meaning the formal order determining where senior royals stand at state functions, remained untouched. She lost none of that. What she lost was any formal path into the machinery of William's future reign, and that loss was total, permanent, and unappealable under the new protocol. William, for his part, didn't celebrate. During a public engagement shortly afterward, a broadcaster asked him directly whether he considered the outcome a victory. He said no, that every generation has to protect the dignity of the family while still preserving the responsibilities that come with the crown. And honestly, that answer tells you exactly who William is now. Not someone chasing conquest, someone drawing a boundary and refusing to gloat about drawing it. Charles, watching that same broadcast from Windsor, reportedly said very little. Someone close to the household described him as relieved the crisis had ended, but visibly aware that something between him and his son had shifted permanently, not broken, but changed in a way that wouldn't fully reverse. And here's the confirmation moment that mattered more than the signature itself. At the next major royal ceremony, all three of them appeared together. Camilla stepped out first. William approached, extended his hand, waited for her to take it, then turned to walk beside his father, matching his pace step for the rest of the event. No statement needed. That single sequence, repeated now with the protocol already signed and permanent, told the country everything about where things actually stood. William later admitted in a private conversation recorded in a written palace account that the public method he'd chosen had caused humiliation that could have been avoided. He didn't withdraw the demand he still believed it was necessary. But he promised his father that any future disagreement between them would start behind closed doors, not in front of cameras. Camilla, in a private meeting with William not long after, told him plainly that he'd judged her harshly, but that the crown belonged to him now, and she accepted that reality without argument. She asked only that he never mistake her fear of being erased for some grander desire to rule in his place. William answered that her place beside his father would never be challenged again, but that no spouse, advisor, or courtier would ever prearrange authority inside his own reign. Full stop, no exceptions. It was over, not with fireworks, not with a scandal that ended a marriage, just a signature, a handshake, and a boundary that had taken 5 years to draw and about 24 hours to enforce once William finally decided to use it. But what this entire story actually reveals about the monarchy William is building, that's a much bigger conversation than one family dispute. So when you step back and actually look at the whole chain of events here, what you're really looking at isn't a story about a jealous stepson or an ambitious stepmother. It's a preview of exactly what kind of king William intends to be, and honestly, it's a lot more calculated than most people give him credit for. Think about the timeline for a second. 5 years of quiet documentation before he ever said a single public word. 2 weeks of sitting on a 22-page memorandum before choosing exactly when and where to use it. A public confrontation delivered with almost zero visible anger, followed within 24 hours by a complete institutional lockout executed through paperwork, not through shouting. That's not someone reacting emotionally to a family slight. That's someone who understands power the way his grandmother did, quietly, patiently, and with total control over timing. This wasn't really about Camilla as a person. It was about whether informal influence, once it's allowed to grow unchecked for long enough, eventually becomes impossible to remove without a public rupture. And genuinely, that's the actual lesson here for anyone watching how William plans to run this monarchy. He will let things drift for years if he has to, right up until the exact moment he decides drift stops being acceptable. Then he acts once completely and doesn't look back. Charles lost something real in all this, and it's worth naming honestly. He lost the ability to protect his wife's future position the way he'd protected her rehabilitation for over 2 decades. That's a genuine grief, not a small one. But he kept his marriage intact, and he kept the institution stable, which for a monarch whose entire reign has been defined by trying to modernize without breaking anything might actually be the best outcome he could have realistically hoped for. Camilla lost the future she'd quietly been building toward. Not her dignity, not her title, not her place beside Charles, but the one thing her office had spent months trying to secure, which was permanence beyond her husband's reign. She built the protocol herself, pushed it across that table herself, and walked directly into the one moment William had been preparing for since before she ever proposed it. And William proved something about himself that the country will remember the next time any question about his authority comes up. He doesn't escalate for the sake of escalating. He absorbs documents, waits, and then moves once decisively in a way nobody can undo. That's not the temperament of a man ruled by old grievances. That's the temperament of a man who watched informal power destroy his mother once and simply refused to let it happen again on his own watch. The boy who spent his childhood watching boundaries blur until it was too late to fix them is now the man drawing those boundaries himself years before he ever wears the crown. He didn't win this by being angry, he won it by being patient, and that more than anything else is what should actually worry anyone who assumes the next reign will be easier to influence than the last one.